The 462 Pacific-type locomotive was the mainstay of passenger service on the Boston and Maine Railroad from 1910 until dieselization came in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Shortly after their arrival, they bumped the 260 Mogul and the 460 10-wheeler type from the mainline passenger hauling duties, relegating those types mostly to rural branch line use and urban commuter trains. Though they were faithful machines, they're sometimes seen as unexceptional due to their large and common numbers. For those same reasons, they're sometimes dubbed the Bud cars of the steam era, after the Bud RDC, which was commonly seen on the Boston and Maine in the 1950s. The early Pacifics were rather plain machines with few accessories. Feed water heaters in the types Alesco and Worthington would later be added to about a half-and-half number of P-1 and P-2s. The Boston and Maine only rostered 12 units in their Class P-1, which were all built in July 1910 by the American Locomotive Company of Schenectady, New York. The P-1s were numbered 861 through 872, but the next year, 1911, the B&M underwent a massive renumbering campaign for its steam locomotives, and the P-1s were renumbered 3600 through 3611. The very first P-1s were scrapped in March of 1938, with the final unit being scrapped in May 1952, that last unit being the 3601. In typical locomotive design fashion of the era, the P-1s were delivered with twin-stage air pumps and acetylene headlights, as well as wooden pilots and spoked wheels on the lead trucks, all aspects that would later be changed as locomotive design developed. Far more numerous than the P-1s were the Boston and Maine's P-2 class Pacifics, which came in at a total of 70 units. There were three subclasses, the P-2As, Bs, and Cs. It's important to note that only a small number of the P-2s were scrapped before the 1950s, with a large number being scrapped in the last decade of steam service on the Boston and Maine. There were 40 P-2As on the Boston and Maine, built in Schenectady in 1911. The first P-2A to be scrapped was number 3632, an ill-fated engine that, in 1936, suffered a collision with the Central Vermont train in Brattleboro, Vermont. The last P-2A was scrapped in 1956. Subclass P-2B consisted of 20 engines built by Schenectady in 1913. One unit, number 3661, was scrapped in November of 1948 after being involved in a wreck in Connecut, Vermont. A wreck which occurred on October 30th, 1948. The rest of the P-2Bs were scrapped in the 1950s, with the final unit being scrapped in 1956. The final subclass of P-2s, the P-2Cs, a total of 10 units, were built by Schenectady in 1916. The first P-2C was retired and scrapped in 1951, with the final P-2C being scrapped in 1956. As we've seen earlier in this series on the Moguls, Consolidations, and Atlantics, at least one Pacific did receive a pilot plow to be used in the wintertime, P-2B number 3663. Experimental smoke deflectors were installed on one of the P-2s, P-2D number 3657. They were short-lived. A few of the Pacifics were actually equipped with tender-mounted turbo generators which were used to power train lighting service. Notice the car electrical connection jack storage plug and off-centered backup light on number 3662. The paint schemes on the Pacifics followed the same painting regimen as most of the Boston and Maine locomotives. However, special mention must be made of custom paint schemes which were applied to the power on two of the Boston and Maine's passenger trains, the Minuteman and the Flying Yankee. Two of the P-2Cs, number 3681 and 3688, were painted buff and blue with red striping to match the colors of the Continental Army for the Minuteman, and was in service in June of 1927. Black running gear and chromed cylinder heads rounded out the scheme. The legend Line of the Minuteman graced the tender sides, and the names William Dawes Jr. and Paul Revere were applied to the cab side in signature style. Later on, in June of 1930, two additional P-2Cs, number 3686 and 3689, were selected for the two-tone green paint on the Flying Yankee. Gold striping and tender herald, with chromed cylinder heads were also used. A special The Flying Yankee plate was cast for display under the headlight of both machines. All 4 of these P2Cs were later repainted back into the B&M's black with tender herald scheme in the 1930s. In a strange twist of fate, one of the surviving Boston and Maine steam locomotives is actually one of the P2s, P2B number 3666, and its survival, a term which is actually debatable, is one of the strangest chapters of steam power on the Boston and Maine. In the 1930s, the bridge carrying the Boston and Maine's Eastern Route main line across the Piscataqua River between Portsmouth and Kittery, Maine, was the old wooden Portsmouth Bridge built in 1842. The old bridge was closed to everything except railroad traffic in 1923 and was still being used by the B&M in 1936 when a committee decided to build a new bridge some 60 feet downstream between Maine and New Hampshire. Construction of the new bridge commenced in 1939 with an opening date of 1940. On Sunday evening, September 10th, 1939, one of the Boston and Maine's Eastern Route local passenger trains, number 2024, departed North Berwick, heading for Boston. With 12 passengers and a crew of 5, the train pulled out onto the old Portsmouth Bridge with number 3666 at the head. As the train slowly crept across the eastern span of the bridge, a crashing sound broke into the night air, and the locomotive, tender, and first car were plunged into the water, breaking through the bridge. Regrettably, fireman Charles Towell of Exeter and engineer John Beatty of Somerville, Massachusetts were presumed dead as the locomotive disappeared beneath the waves. Both bodies were later recovered. Passengers had all been saved when the train's air brakes applied, and there was nobody in the first car, which had also plunged beneath the waves. It was later discovered that pylons from the construction of the new bridge had weakened the structure of the old one and caused the span to fail under the weight of the locomotive. A large caisson used in the construction of the new bridge had wrapped around a piling of the railroad structure and pulled it out of place. Railroad traffic was later diverted to the Western Route main line until the new bridge, the Sarah Mildred Long Bridge, was completed with a railroad span under the road bridge. In another strange twist of fate, in the late years of the 2010s, a new Sarah Mildred Long Bridge was constructed to replace the old bridge which had been completed in 1940, the construction of which had contributed to the wreck in 1939. While dredging for spans of the new bridge, wheels from engine 3666 were actually dredged from the bottom of the river. Pilot wheels from the locomotive and trucks from the locomotive's tender were recovered and pulled from the depths. This was not an intentional effort, however, it was a strange coincidence, given that the locomotive and the original bridge had been so closely linked, and now the locomotive and the new bridge were also closely linked. One of the wheel sets is on display at the Kittery Naval and Historical Museum in Kittery, Maine, along with some recognition of the incident. 3666 was moved several times in the 1960s and 1990s to help make room for the New Hampshire Port Authority's pier expansion, but efforts to raise the locomotive were decided to be far too costly. The P-1 and P-2 Pacifics had been the power for many long and medium-distance passenger trains through the 1930s and 1940s. But as the late 1940s came on and diesel locomotives arrived in increasing numbers, the P-1s and the P-2s found themselves relegated mostly to medium-distance and short-distance commuter passenger trains. When the early 1950s came and the P-1s disappeared entirely, the P-2s soldiered on mostly in commuter roles until 1955 and 1956, the long and medium-distance passenger trains having long been replaced with diesel locomotives. As the clock ran down for steam locomotion on the Boston and Maine, and units were retired and scrapped with increasing numbers, railfans scrambled to capture what they could of this fleeting image of steam-powered railroading in northern New England. Photographers like Russell Monroe and Albert Hale spent hours photographing units at locations like Boston, Lexington, Bedford, Lowell, Haverhill, Rockport, and Salem, as they ran commuter trains in and out of Boston. Albert Hale and Robert Chaffin shot 8mm movies of the P-2 Pacifics as they thundered out of Boston with commuter trains. Photographer and B&M employee Donald Robinson also took films, including one from the cab of a P-2 Pacific. And B&M dispatcher Preston Johnson managed to get a number of sound recordings of steam locomotives, including the P-2 Pacifics, which were later pressed onto a vinyl record called Vanishing Vapors. Though they had once been seen as somewhat unexceptional machines by some, by 1955 and 1956, the P-2 Pacifics were once again well respected. Seen as a bastion of steam power on the Boston and Maine, and the largest steam locomotives still in service on the railroad. Perhaps nobody appreciated the P-2 Pacifics as much as Elizabeth Quint Foley, a soft-spoken librarian from Salem, Massachusetts, who worked for the Essex Institute. Elizabeth fell in love with the P-2s, especially number 3674, which she often called her engine. Elizabeth's photography of the P-2 Pacifics, taken mostly in Boston, Salem, and on the Gloucester branch, are some of the most dynamic and beautiful shots of steam locomotives ever taken on the Boston and Maine, and showcase those powerful P-2s as they went about their duties in their final days on the system. Elizabeth's love for number 3674 was so great that she actually approached the railroad about purchasing the engine, and was quoted a price of about $5,000. The whole situation was written up in the Boston Daily Record in an article on Monday, November 8, 1954, describing Elizabeth's fondness for the locomotive and her hope to purchase the engine and put it on display somewhere near Salem, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, it was not to be. As the story goes, Elizabeth was away on vacation when the railroad tried to reach her to finalize the details of possibly purchasing the locomotive. They were unable to reach her, and the plans fell through. The last photograph Russell Monroe ever took of a Boston and Maine steam locomotive operating in revenue service was B&M P-2 number 3662, eastbound on the Eastern Route Main Line at Salem Station in Salem, Massachusetts, on Friday, July 20th, 1956. Earlier, the locomotive had left coaches in the yard at Castle Hill and was en route to the Salem engine house. The very last photo we were able to find, sent by Brad Kippen, was taken by Al Hale and shows B&M 3654 and B&M 3662 the same day in the terminal. According to Russell Monroe, he spoke with an engineer that he knew, and the very following Monday, July 23rd, was the final day of operations of B&M steam locomotives, with 2 trips from Marblehead covered. Russell had left the area for a weekend trip to the central and western United States, and interestingly enough was photographing the former Boston and Maine R1s on the Baltimore and Ohio. On the final day of steam service, Al Hale was not in the area. He was up on the Conway branch. In another interesting synchronicity, it's also worth noting that the last week of steam on the Boston and Maine is also the same week that the Andrea Doria sunk. Unfortunately, as time moves forward and leaves behind the 3674, all the P-1 Pacifics, and virtually all the P-2s, gone too are many of the enthusiasts: Donald Robinson, Preston Johnson, Elizabeth Foley, and many others who chased and photographed these locomotives. And gone as well are many of those who worked on these engines and rode behind them. But Russell Monroe is still with us, who chased these locomotives and photographed them in his early youth in the 1950s. We sat down with Russell recently to record some of his memories and some of his stories regarding these locomotives as they had their final days on the Boston and Maine.
Yeah, I told him. I don't remember what the engine numbers were, but you see pictures of them.
Yeah. Where'd you ride from?
I rode over from Marblehead to Salem when they put the engines to bed for the night. You knew the engineer. He lived in my neighborhood, right within a half a mile from where I lived. His name was Carl Kennison. He's gone now. And he says, "Oh, you ride out." He says, "Why don't you come down? We're coming down Marblehead." I said, "I'll take you to Salem." Okay. He used to let me ride the cab of the engine over to Salem, and then he'd ride me home in his car. I did that as long as I wanted. So I had 2 or 3 cab rides in those things. But I don't remember what the numbers were. No, they were nice engines. I wish they'd saved one.
There's still one.
Well, I know. Yeah, I don't like to think about that one.
Yeah. Did you know it was towards the end? You knew it was
Oh, yeah. That's why I was down there every day.
Yeah.
I went down there every day for almost a year.
Yeah.
People thought I was crazy, but I don't give a damn.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss a new video. And head on over to our website, www.B&MRRHS.org, where you can learn how to support our nonprofit organization, sign up to become a member, browse an extensive online archive of B&M materials, watch more programs, listen to our podcast, or browse our online store.